Exactly 46 years ago, the United Nations officially began to recognize March 8th as International Women's Day after decades of women-led revolutionary rallies for women's rights, equality, and equity. It is against this backdrop and with great pleasure and privilege that I am addressing you today, March 8th, 2021, as Dominica joins the United Nations and numerous countries in celebrating International Women's Day. International Women's Day is a global day for celebrating the social, economic, cultural, and political achievements of women. This year's UN theme for International Women's Day is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. The theme celebrates the tremendous efforts by women and girls around the world in shaping a more equal future and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, the theme highlights the impact that girls and women worldwide have as healthcare workers, caregivers, innovators, and community organizers during the COVID-19 pandemic. Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World is also aligned with the 65th session of the Commission on the Status of Women priority theme, Women's Full and Effective Participation and Decision-Making in Public Life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. My fellow Dominicans, throughout this unprecedented pandemic, Dominican women stood and continue to stand firm at the front line as healthcare workers, caregivers, public servants, and community workers. We are acutely aware that our first line of defense are our healthcare workers, the majority of whom are women. Our nurses, doctors, community health aides, lab professionals, and other women who work in the healthcare sector have led and continue to lead the fight against COVID-19. Our healthcare workers were expected to go out when the majority of Dominicans were asked to stay home. Our women combated and continue to combat the brunt of this pandemic at the COVID Center, government quarantine facilities, the Dominica China Friendship Hospital, and the various health centers around the island. The government of Dominica commends and celebrates all our healthcare workers for their resilience and sacrifice during these unprecedented times. Today, we are not only celebrating our women on the front line of this pandemic in the health sector, but the contribution of all women across all sectors leading the way in Dominica's COVID-19 response and recovery. We recognize and applaud our women's perspectives, initiatives, skills, knowledge, and experiences in contributing to the containment of the spread of COVID-19, developing Dominica's approach to COVID-19, protecting and aiding our vulnerable populations during this pandemic, and contributing at the highest level of decision-making. However, if we, as Dominican women, are to truly achieve an equal future in a COVID-19 world, Dominicans as a whole need to unrelentingly combat the issue of gender-based violence currently occurring on our island. Anecdotal evidence suggests a spike in violence against women and girls in Dominica. Gender-based violence, domestic violence, and intimate partner violence are in and of themselves symptoms of a global pandemic. Violence against women and girls lead to loss of lives for some. For survivors, it could cause physical injuries, displacement, and post-traumatic stress. Women can be psychologically scarred for life due to increased violence. These highly negative experiences are more than likely to set back all the gains we have made towards women's economic empowerment as a country and as a people. What makes matters worse is the general acceptance of gender-based violence as an internal issue. There is also a poor understanding. Most people do not think of gender-based violence as a human rights violation. Most often, gender-based violence is perceived as a petty internal family problem immune to external intervention. The government of Dominica condemns all forms of violence against women and girls. My ministry, through the Bureau of Gender Affairs, has and will continue to work to mitigate all forms of violence against women and girls in Dominica. Women's Day 2020. As a minister for Youth Development and Empowerment, Youth at Risk, Gender Affairs, Senior Security, and Dominicans with Disabilities, I pledged my support and commitment to strengthening the policy framework on gender equality and equity in Dominica, to empower the Bureau of Gender Affairs, the Social Welfare Division, and the Youth Development Division to ensure that the needs of most vulnerable populations are included in government's initiatives towards a gender-equal, dynamic Dominica. Considering the current COVID-19 realities, and in keeping with my promise of greater inclusion of the vulnerable population, my ministry, by way of the Bureau of Gender Affairs, Youth Development Division, and the Social Welfare Division, has achieved the following gains towards a gender-equal Dominica. Through the Engender Project, the Bureau of Gender Affairs was able to improve support services for survivors of gender-based violence through training of police officers, provision of safe housing, and increased awareness-raising programs. Through the COVID-19 social cash transfer, the ministry was able to support and mitigate the socio-economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and provided temporary income support to selected vulnerable individuals and families to address their basic needs, including food, health, education, and other necessities. Approximately 54.8% of the beneficiaries are women. This was a much-needed cash injection for vulnerable households strapped for cash. Through the 40 and under housing program, the ministry is currently providing grants of up to $10,000 to the youth under 40 years of age to assist them in becoming property owners. This is one of several policy measures aimed at improving women's access to land and property. Thus far, 55% of the applicants are women. Through the project entitled Enhancing Capacities and Consciousness of Women and Youth to Achieve Climate Resilience, we were able to sensitize 120 persons on the role of women in disaster risk response and mitigation. Despite these successes, the Sustainable Development Goal 5 continue to highlight that the global progress towards equality and empowerment of women and girls on several fronts still has a long way to go. Therefore, I will stand by my 2020 pledge and the commitment to ensure that these government's initiatives are geared towards a gender-equal, dynamic Dominica. In closing, I want to acknowledge the vital contribution of all women during COVID-19. Your strength, knowledge, skills, and input are valued and needed. The government of Dominica stands in solidarity with the Bureau of Gender Affairs and the Dominica National Council of Women in observance and celebration of this year's International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day to all. Let us work to and for the empowerment of all women and girls. I thank you.